Uh, okay, I'd like to invite our speakers to come up again, as well as we have two other panelists, Leslie Carhart, who's from Dragos, and Benjamin Burke, who's from Dispel. And as I mentioned before, the reason I'm inviting them up here is the speakers were using their products, so this is a way they can add any content if you have questions and things like that. So let me start. If there's any questions, Rob, do you have another question? Because I cut you off there. If you want to follow up.
I was curious about the level of inventory solution provided, how granular you got, get down firmware levels, identify vulnerabilities, that layer. I think it's a model that cut only Ethernet-based assets, or is it capable of digging further?
Go ahead. No,
you have to turn it on.
That's right.
Did you know that? That's amazing.
It works quite well.
I'm gonna hold
actually.
it just like. Can you hear me? Okay. I think you can hear me, but just talking. What we're monitoring right now is we're not getting quite to that level of detail, and I think that's again as a refining of our inventory. I think that's an area that we're trying to get to. But some of that, one of the things that I didn't mention, but it was one of our major use cases, was the passivity of the tool. It's kind of a non-starter. I'm sorry, there's a bunch of people who can't see me. There's a, which is fine for me, maybe not for you, I don't know. Putting an active tool into a control system was unnerving a little bit for us, and so we don't want to deploy an agent because of the warranty issues and constraints or potential operational impacts that would be unintended that we might cause. I think we've got some different ways to do that. I think it's been mentioned again. So change management database and asset management database, like those kinds of things are part of our processes, but not necessarily that wasn't the direct use case we were trying to attack with this case. Yes.
Sure, no, not at all. It's interesting to hear his take on it because I learned a lot about our product from how our customers view it. So again, the big challenge, the exciting challenge that we've had is creating an entirely passive monitoring platform because we can't do the things that we're used to as security people in 2019, which are like installing EDR and installing asset management clients. So everything has to be passive. So we're off, a span port or a tap, et cetera, some kind of data diode. And we're getting lots and lots of packets. That's all we're getting. And when we have to make these determinations about hosts that are the same types of things we'd get out of those more sophisticated modern tools, and we have to do it all based on packet captures. So that's data that builds over time as we see more and more traffic. So we start out with simple things like, layer 1 through 3, identification of devices, and then we start looking at like that layer 2 and 3 traffic, and we start saying, what else do we know about these things? We know their MAC address and their IP address, perhaps, depending on where the sensor's placed. And we know things like host names, DNS, et cetera. But what else can we say? So we start tagging the host with additional pieces of information. So let's say we see a particular protocol traversing. We document that. Maybe a service type, like let's say we see SMB1 out there. That's very relevant to a lot of security people's interests for multiple reasons. So we tag the host that it was monitored using SMB1 and perhaps send a notification as well. So that's a complex layer of tagging and asset identification that gets built up as our tool sits out there and it collects data. Because we can't know things about a system until it talks about them in some context or another. So that's just the peril of having to exist entirely passive in these sensitive environments. It's kind of an exciting challenge.
Does that address your question, Rob? Okay. Are there other questions? Does anyone else have a question? I have some questions if you don't. All right, let me direct one to Dispel, to Ben in particular. I mean, William, please comment as well. But it really had to do with the connectivity that William showed. Is this a dynamic thing or a static kind of a connectivity, or can you comment on that? Because I would think it needs to be dynamic in a sense.
Yeah, and I think that was sort of brought up a little bit, son. Cool. So that was brought up a little bit, maybe in another session as well, about a dynamic infrastructure. So for Will's connectivity process, it is dynamic, and that's in two ways. The first is that initial connection point. It wasn't good enough to be an encrypted connection. It also had to be one that was changing over time. So the fact that it's going to an Amazon server makes it look like that person's watching Netflix. It's not creating an association between his operator and CT water. And then if that pathway is changing, it then further obfuscates what's going on. We talked a lot about obfuscation as a tool for bad guys, but it's also a tool for the good guys as well.
Did you want to comment?
Sure. I think for us, that was actually quite the bonus, right? As security professionals, or as network professionals, sometimes we think statically, right? What's your IP address? Oh, it's always going to be this IP address at a VPN concentrator. What's the host name? Well, when Ben introduced that to me, that was kind of the game changer, because we've heard of technologies, and I baked off quite a bit of other technologies that do encryption from end to end, but the ability to create dynamic tunnels was kind of not mind-blowing, but yeah, almost there, pretty much. It was a game changer. It was really a game changer for us, and being able to talk to senior leadership about, at a high level, what that meant for Connecticut Water and really making it more secure than we were in the past, and at the same time making sure that our users can actually use the product. It was a big deal, so they bought into that.
Let me follow up with that to Leslie. I mean, because your product and Drago's products. I mean, a key thing of all of we had a session yesterday, a workshop where we talked about OT threat detection and response, and it's one of my little favorite areas. But one of the things that's there that most solutions, and I don't know that Drago's completely fits into this category or not, but many of them say, what we're going to do is establish something normal, and then we're going to detect anything abnormal. And I'm just sitting here thinking, when I asked a question about the dynamic, if you're changing something for obfuscation purposes or for whatever, I mean, then how do you deal with that if you're trying to monitor things? I just wonder if that does have the, and I don't know if you know their product or not, or can comment completely, but.
Yeah, so that's an interesting debate, perhaps a contentious debate, which I don't think it should be in the ICS space, is whether we want to do things more through that machine learning approach of something's changed, how much has it changed, quantify that change, and tell the operator about that, or whether you want to look for more, analytic-based things. And we've taken the approach that we prefer more analytic-based things for that reason, because there's this conception that ICS environments never change, and especially in the modern era of ICS networks, that's not necessarily true. Things do change. Human beings changed. We're not computers. Our operation habits, yes, machine learning can learn a lot about how we type and how we operate, but really things will constantly be changing in those environments. So yes, we do use machine learning as part of our solution, and that's baked into a lot of our analytics, and we provide baselining functionality because that's something that a lot of operators really rely on, and they find it very useful. So of course it's there, but we try to tend more towards more complex analytics that combine that with other things that we know are related to adversary activity for that reason.
Does anybody else want to comment? Or?
Yeah, really quick. I would say also that those things can work entirely in parallel. So for instance, in Will's system, while the connection pathway is changing time over time, because we are using virtual infrastructure, we are destroying it and rebuilding it, once you actually get into the network where things are happening, perhaps the magic of the OT world is happening, that's not changing. It's just the way that somebody gets there. So you can have these things work in consort rather than in conflict.
Michael, do you see much, two questions. One is in the market. I mean, I may go there to see it. I haven't done that. And if I get in trouble, I will refer them to you. But when you see that and you see the services, I mean, it's quite eye-opening. And I love all the acronyms. I couldn't copy them all down. There's a few too many there, but I was fascinated by it. But do you see that happening, anything similar to that in the OT or ICS world? I mean, a lot of that is, and I understand that's where the money is. People go where the money is, and a lot of it is in ransomware off the people, but.
Well, I mean, ransomware is an OT environment problem too, very much so, and likely to become much more so.
Yeah, that's why I'm asking.
I also don't see any reason why more specific. We haven't seen, these are the main services we've seen. I haven't seen a lot that looks at this, particularly the services for IoT type. But it wouldn't be surprising if they you know, if they start to appear, or you can combine services here that will have that effect. I mean, you know, DDoS is DDoS, right? I mean, so you can affect things, you know, in an IoT environment with the services as they stand. I should note, with regard to dark web, we have looked and done some other efforts to look at.
Can everybody hear him, by the way?
Oh, I'm sorry. Is my mic not on? No, it's on. Okay, sorry. We have
No,
looked
I
at some efforts.
can hear
Some of the energy and gas and oil folks have said to us that they have looked a fair amount into sort of voting areas of the dark web and so on, to just follow the political nature of things. This is sort of off not in the software as a service area, but there are lots of forums that are voting, you know, which are the worst companies, and going on about what's really bad and what should we attack this week and so on.
Oh,
And so
really?
they're keeping some track of that and understanding where they are on all that. So just as a note that there is activity looking particularly at IoT environments in that way.
I've seen, I mean, I've read stuff, and I haven't been on the dark web, so I've looked into buying that myself, obviously. But, you know, I mean, I understand there's a big concern today is that, you know, cyber criminals are more than happy, experienced, very capable type of hackers, I'll use the term general hackers, or cyber criminals, I'll use that term better, are more than happy to sell their services to people today. And you know, I mean, you hear about even nation states taking advantage of that. You know, it's probably a little game these days. Probably people in the nation states who get the expertise, then go out on their own. I don't know. That'd be a good business, right? But I'm just wondering but it's not, what I haven't heard, and it was just interesting, was one is I'm going to sell you this thing. You tell me who you want to attack, and I will go through the whole kill chain, all of the steps that are required, not the kill chain, but the value chain, as you described it. But it's more like I'll do that for you. It's not like I'll sell you this little part of the service, I'll sell you this little part of the service. And I'm just wondering if anybody wants to comment on that.
This is multiple people selling different parts of the service. It's possible that someone sells all of them, but in general, you're piecing together parts of the service and they're working together.
And to sort of speak to the sophistication of those cyber criminals for a moment, a lot of what we actually work with is with threat intelligence teams and trying to mask what they look like so they can effectively do their work in and amongst cyber criminals. And it's incredibly difficult to mask yourself as a criminal because they have all the same defenses looking at where you're coming from, what you look like. I think you saw that you can't get on
Oh, you're saying the
Dream Market.
cyber criminals have the same defenses?
Yeah.
Oh,
You can't get on Dream Market unless you're coming from a Tor address. So they have a lot of structure in place to kind of hiccup the threat intel teams that are trying to bring them down too.
does that make it difficult for your threat intelligence? Dragos does an awful lot of, so you know, Dragos has threat intelligence, not just the defensive stuff.
So
because they-
two
they-
small comments
threat
about that. The first one is people should be looking at the dark web. You should be getting intelligence that includes information about what's going on there because that's where credentials get dumped. That's where information about your company is getting dropped by criminals, et cetera. So you should be seeking out intelligence services that do that type of work or doing it in-house. The second one is if you want the canary in the coal mine for how this is going to look, the ransomware stuff is going to look in ICS, look at IoT right now. Look at the hack on Dyn. Look at the attack on Dyn. And where we see like IoT devices being used in mass in a botnet, it's all about money in the crimeware space. But keep in mind that in ICS we use a lot of the same devices across a large landscape. So there's no reason that a criminal can't find a common ICS device that's used across many verticals and is very exposed, like an RTU or some kind of PLC, and use that in their botnet as well. There's absolutely no reason that couldn't happen if they just determine that it's out there and it's exposed and it's useful in attacks, and there's a lot of them.
Are there any other? Yes, please.
Yeah, John Brunsma from Epcor Utilities. We're in the same business. Have you guys been able to
Which
use
business?
successfully data diodes?
Oh,
And the question is to William and Jason. The use of data diodes for technology.
he's talking about using data diodes. That's
Yeah.
why I
Yeah, so man, maybe I should just let you answer. We've evaluated them. I don't know. I just have a hard time with data diodes in that it's supposed to be this kind of one-way interface, and it turns out you got to have 2 boxes on one side of the one-way interface and 2 other boxes on the other side of the one-way interface, and then it just seems like a lot. So I think that what I would say is we're intrigued by some of the new deep packet inspection and app ID, user ID, other things in some of the not necessarily today next gen, but what was next gen firewalls. I think there's some great stuff out there. I think there are some other pretty good things. It's just it's a challenge, and from us as being sort of resource constrained, it just adds some overhead that I don't. That, again, I use it's my favorite cliche is the juice is worth the squeeze. I don't know that the juice is worth the squeeze for us to try to deploy those because the benefit derived is not commensurate with the expense and then the overhead to maintain them.
Kind of the same boat. We just haven't seen, there is a particular value on it, but for Connecticut main water at least, all our operators have direct access to the OT, and it's always one way. So we really haven't explored that much or had the need to explore it that much.
Just to comment on that, based on some of the feedback on data diodes, you may want to look at different vendors because some of the scenarios that were described, there's a lot of different technologies out there, a lot of different approaches to handle use cases that are very different from what was just described. So I'd encourage you to go out and look at some different vendors to compare technologies.
I think they're one of the more interesting things that I get asked about at conferences all the time and I never see in a real life environment. So yeah, I mean, they're definitely an interesting technology and I hope that they get used more in the future, but I almost never see them in place in a customer.
I guess like just sort of as a full scale or full spectrum of debate, there is a certain use case of if I want a unidirectional flow, then that can be a legitimate use case. If I want to push things out in one direction, make sure that nothing comes back in, there is some debate of do I want to then build an entirely new system to actually operate on that? Do I need to have remote access that's operating? If I can ensure that once something gets into the network, it's isolated there, is that good enough? It's kind of all a spectrum for you to decide.
Yeah, let's not get into a debate about data diodes. Okay, I mean, I think it was a good question. I don't misunderstand, but I think that's something that should be considered.
My name is Vladimir. I'm from Braskem, and first of all, I'd like to say that the presentations was very good, and it's like we are in the same boat. I believe in all the companies. I am from the petrochemical company, and we have all of these stuffs we are talking about, next generation firewalls and firewalls and all the stuffs. And I believe the most critical thing is the users, and they are not, they do not understand so much about the security. And taking care of the ICS, it's very difficult. But from my point of view, and my question is to see your point of view at how we can take care of the external devices as IoT device and this kind of things. That devices that are not under the fence of the facilities. I'm not sure if the question was clear. Or...
Just to clarify, you're talking about IoT devices inside the network?
No.
Or?
The not only IoT device, but all the external devices. That's, for example, some monitors or I believe for the water and energy, you have lots of external devices that you should be monitoring and taking care of. So how difficult is this to maintain the security of this external device that is not under in your internal network? It's outside.
Yeah, so it's hard. We could just go with that and oversimplify. I think that, so when I think of So our exposure, we have, I told you, 870-something thousand customers. So that's a meter everywhere we've got. So we sort of break it down into kind of two categories of attacks that we really worry about. We think of the wholesale type of attack, which would be like a whole bunch of meters at one time. And then we think about the retail meter, which the best equivalency I could give you is like if you knew and your neighbor was the cable guy and he could go and like tweak your cable so now you got free cable, that's a retail, right? Like so somebody can come and just mess with one meter or another. They put spoons in leads or whatever to try to trick us, but that anyway, we can go down that rabbit hole. So wholesale and retail are kind of the attack vectors that we sort of think about with the sort of edge devices. It's imperative that you have monitoring. It's imperative that you harden them. I could talk about this all day, like, and we can do that, but so I don't want to monopolize on the panel, but I think it's a challenge. I think, again, you've got to know what you have. You need to understand how you're using it. You need to think about ways that someone could use that against you, how it could be used to harm your customer, the experience for your customer related to their use, and take those sort of things. And then we've, again, deployed Defense in Depth, Purdue, different strategies to do that. I like some of the stuff that Will was talking about. So we've got different layers of encryption. We have different communications. We use different protocols. We've tried to attack that in ways that we feel like will enable us to use them and own them and have them, but not anybody else. So we'll see how that goes.
Yeah, it was a challenge for us a couple of years ago. Honestly, all those devices are behind a secured, isolated network. So from a network perspective, so there's things that connect directly with LAN or like an ELAN or an MPLS that are completely behind that sensitive network and with cell, because of the remote connectivity. We were fortunate enough to have the manpower to do so, but we encrypted all forms of communications between the houses and pump stations with radio, with cell, and we did it just like I just said with IPsec, so encrypting everything from point to point. Again, it was about 3 years in the making, but that's how we kind of mitigated that kind of risk. Make sense?
We have I'll just mention, we have a research project, I'd be interested in the reaction, where we're developing a lightweight agent that manages both processing and IP whitelists for devices that have very small amount of memory capability or whatever that might sit on the edge or might be in the environment you're talking about. And then using blockchain, Ethereum blockchain, to distribute the whitelist. So we're looking at sort of an approach like that. I don't know how it compares or how it deals with the more practical approaches being used here.
I don't have a direct comment on that and using blockchain in that system in that way, but I do think that it's important. It's knowing at that very edge point, what can you put on an isolated network, or how are you going to connect that back in? There are a number of ways to do it. Direct cable is always an option. It can be a very expensive option, but there are, whether it's through, I know that there are some leveraging cell technologies to get that connection out. It's once you have connectivity to a broader network, how are you securing that traffic and making sure that people can't backdoor in? Obviously, if you have a lot of facilities that are out somewhere remote, maybe the physical security is a problem that you need to address as well. Sure. But that's something to consider.
If those devices are physically accessible, that's a whole different set of challenges. And one of the things that I can suggest is make sure that they don't have easily accessible interfaces that are consumer standard if possible. And if they have to, spend a lot of time with a good IoT pen testing company. And there's companies out there that'll just test the security of IoT devices. Make sure that they beat them up a lot and figure out how they could be exploited, and you have a regular patch cycle for them. It's so simple, but I mean, it's just, you're exposed, people are gonna mess with them. We've seen that with smart meters, so.
One other thing I would add to that is that there's a consistency that needs to happen with that as well. I know we can oversimplify, and sometimes executive management sometimes connotes good security posture today with finished, and that's something you've got to work on. So I think it's important that you have somebody really thoroughly evaluate the interfaces and the hardware on the regular. They need to be constantly looking at that, just as we've talked about attack vectors and surfaces changed, attack methodologies changed. You just need to make sure that you're trying to stay commensurate with your testing on that, with what's going on in the world.
Is that it? It's okay, I mean, because there's beer out there. I'm not encouraging anyone to quit, but I'm just saying that would be fine. Okay, well, would you join me in thanking the panel and the speakers? I thought it was a very good session today. Thank you very much.